The truth about gain staging is not what you think. Every year or so there is a buzzword in the music production community: gluey compression, -14 LUFS, and currently I would say that it is gain staging. So what is gain staging and how important is it? Gain staging is managing the volume of your signal at each process that it passes through, so that nothing gets too quiet or too loud before it hits the next stage of the processing. It used to be incredibly important for managing the signal to noise ratio with analog hardware. Compared to digital equipment, analog was a lot noisier, so you actually had to take into account your input and your output gain, or gain staging. A lot of people think it's not as important now because they work inside the box and they've got 32-bit floating point, which basically means unlimited dynamic range, but more on that later. Certain pieces of hardware, like analog preamps, they would vary in sound character depending on how hard the input gain was driven. This is generally not the case with modern equipment. Take your audio interface, for example. This stays really clean up until you get to about 0 decibels. And then once you exceed that, once you clip, you get harsh digital distortion. Not the gradual driven sound that you used to get in, say, a Neve console or preamp. And some of the digital emulation plugins do have sweet spots. For instance, I think UAD often say around -18 dBFS, and some of them have a nominal level of even -12 dBFS. But for the most part, it's considered that plugins don't really need to have their gain managed or their gain staged. So while it used to be extremely important, is it still important at all? Well, yes, it is still important. For instance, I see so much mixing advice saying that you can just push your mix as hard as you want because of 32-bit floating point. So what is this 32-bit float point argument? So plugins and effects, they used to have a smaller capacity for internal headroom. There used to be less dynamic range available, either 16-bit or 24-bit. Both would clip at 0 dB, but there was more dynamic range or more headroom available before they got to this point. For 16-bit, it was 96 dB of headroom, and for 24-bit, it was 144 decibels of headroom. However, with 32-bit floating point, there is in theory up to 1500 decibels of internal headroom available. That's a lot before you're going to introduce clipping or digital distortion. A lot of people seem to think that you can now just run your mix as hot as you like, and because theoretically your DAW can handle 1500 dB of internal headroom, that's not really the whole story. Just because you can slam your audio through your chain and not receive any digital clipping doesn't mean you should do it, and here's why. So if you're going to run everything hot, you're going to need to have a limiter on your master bus. But if you feed that limiter with really hot material, really loud material, it's going to have to work a lot harder. And if a limiter is working really hard, then it often introduces distortion. There can also be other artifacts like pumping. Either way, a limiter that is pegged rarely sounds good, and it's not really doing its actual job, which is to catch rogue transients. It will change the sound character of your mix if your limiter is working flat out. Also, as mentioned earlier, some plugins are emulation plugins, and they have an optimal range for working in. So whether it's -18, -12. So for that reason, gain staging is important here. But it's not just analog emulations. A lot of the processes like compressors and analog EQs and saturators, they all are coded to behave in a certain way. So a lot of these processes create distortion as a function. So when you abuse them, when you send them really hot material, they're going to add more distortion as a result of this anyway. So you're going to end up with a lot of extra distortion in your mix. If you work to your DAW's natural headroom rather than clipping and limiting everything excessively, then you'll find that your mix usually works better. If everything is loud, then nothing is loud. You need dynamic range, you need loud soft, you need the relative. And in my opinion, mixes without dynamics are boring. And this comes from someone that loves drum and bass and that one-upmanship of trying to get something to sound louder. But loudness is only one piece of the puzzle. There's so much more to mixing than just loudness. So I find if you can mix and try and keep your faders at unity gain, at 0 dB, and without having them all over the place, you manage the gain coming in, manage the gain coming out, you tend to have better sounding mixes. And yes, if you are doing genres that do need a bit more juice, you can limit and clip, but try and spread it out across the project. Don't just have the limiter on your master absolutely going ham. It will probably sound naff. At the time it might sound good because you're like, wow, this is loud, this is intense, but when you come away and come back to it, you'll realize, oh, actually this just sounds flat and lifeless. So while in theory you can not give a fuck about gain staging because of 32-bit, just because you can do it doesn't mean your mix is going to sound better for it. In fact, they probably won't. Truthfully, if you keep pushing everything, you're going to introduce so much more harsh distortion into your mix that it's going to sound worse for it. There's a place for loud, but it shouldn't be everywhere. So let's bring this back full circle. What is the truth about gain staging? To sum up, it's important to know about and understand why it's there. It's a good idea to keep your eye on the gain and really don't mix everything stupidly hot. If you have most channels exceeding 0 dB and you've got loads of clippers and loads of limiters, then yes, you might get it loud, but there's probably a good chance you've introduced a lot more distortion than you needed to. And digital distortion doesn't sound amazing. And eventually too much of this makes your mix actually sound aggressive, it makes your mixes sound harsher, and generally it's actually less pleasant to listen to. I find a lot of modern mixes today unpleasant. Maybe I'm just getting old. So gain staging is really just managing the flow of the input gain and the output gain. And yes, it is still important. And although it was probably initially more important in the analog domain, it still is important in digital, but you probably don't need to obsess about it. And if you just want to write amazing tunes and you don't want to spend all your time mixing, then visit the link in the description and I can do the mixing or mastering for you. And I'll see you on another video. Take care.